Hi everyone, my name is Aureen Wilford. I am a research psychologist and a research analyst at the Utah Criminal Justice Center. We'd like to welcome you to this case management lunch and learn session today. This virtual skills series is the first of 3 events that will be held this fall. Today's lunch and learn is the first of 3 sessions addressing case management. The next skills series will be using program data to reduce recidivism, which will be held in October. And the final event with limited capacity is a reading group that will be held in December. The reading group will discuss the second edition of What Works and Doesn't in Reducing Recidivism. Also, for your information, these videos will be recorded, and those recordings will be shared on the College of Social Work and Utah Criminal Justice Center's YouTube sites. CEUs will be available for attendance or viewing of these 3 sessions, and attendees will be asked after the 3rd session, which is the 24th of September, to follow a link to a short evaluation and quiz. Your CEU certificate will then be sent electronically after successful completion and evaluation of the quiz. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Emily Salisbury, who is an associate professor and our newly appointed director of the Utah Criminal Justice Center in the Department of Social Work here at the University of Utah. She will be hosting these 3 case management lunch and learn sessions. Emily is a trained criminologist and has a master's in forensic psychology and a PhD in criminal justice from the University of Cincinnati. Her primary areas of expertise are in correctional rehabilitation, risk needs assessments, and understanding the unique needs and risks of system-involved women. She is frequently called upon by agencies to assist in operationalizing gender-responsive correctional strategies based off of female offender pathways to crime and assistance. Emily has also co-developed the WRNA, the Women's Risk Needs Assessment Tool, and has extensive experience in training people on how to use and implement this gender-responsive tool. In the evaluations of agencies and in treatment facilities, we have noted that case management is a complex, challenging, and often overlooked or neglected area for various reasons. We've noted that clinicians have very high caseloads, they are multitasking, they have time constraints, and numerous other reasons make comprehensive case management often very challenging. In today's session, Emily will introduce us to an overview of why we case plan and how it is a crucial part of the behavior change process. And then in the subsequent 2 sessions, we will review 1 or 2 case studies and begin to create a case plan for building change. Further, Emily will take us through the process of case management using the WRNA. We are here to support and to learn from each other today, and hopefully in seeing how Emily navigates case studies, you'll be able to glean valuable ideas or practices that you could include in your daily assessment and management of your clients. I'll now hand over the time to Emily.
Maureen, thank you so much for that really lovely introduction. I appreciate that. As I share my screen here, I also just really want to thank those of you who are joining us and kind of streaming in, and really thank also the team who put this together and are making stuff happen on the back end, including, of course, Aureen, Jessica, and Emily. So thank you for that. So I thought, let's just first of all kind of start. Obviously, this session is about case planning to target criminogenic need. And I really just wanted to initially kind of start off with this idea that, first of all, for those of you who don't know, yep, I'm Emily Salisbury. Thanks very much. Apologies for those still streaming in. You can find us on Twitter too. Yes, we're actually quite active on Twitter. I thought we would start off kind of talking a little bit about the importance of risk, need, and responsivity principles. It's my understanding, I'm relatively new to the state of Utah, but it's my understanding that there may be a little bit still of understanding that's needed around the importance of how case planning is really tied to risk, need, and responsivity principles. And so we're going to start our conversation there today, and also focus on the basics, of course, of what it means to be doing assessment-driven case planning and its role really in driving and facilitating behavior change. It really doesn't matter if we have a risk assessment tool, honestly, if we're not using it to its fullest potential. And that's surrounding this effort of using case planning to facilitate behavior change. So for today, we will probably get to the first two learning goals, and in subsequent sessions, we will also start to apply the principles of case planning using case vignettes, and hopefully by the end, building your confidence to start creating case plans with your clients. So assessment. You all have probably been hearing lots about this for quite some time, and you're going to hear a little bit about it from me too, right? This is the importance of assessing risk, assessing need, and assessing responsivity becomes pretty critically important in understanding all of the different profiles of needs that people come to us with. So these are the principles that really drive case planning. So what makes programming and interventions effective, right? We have to talk a little bit about this idea of the risk principle, and which really is surrounding this idea of who to treat. You know, again, we have so many people coming to us. We have high caseloads. The science behind correctional treatment and rehabilitation has really transformed the way we do business in corrections and in correctional treatment. This idea that not every, justice-involved person, not every offender poses the same risk to the community. I sometimes still have to have conversations with judges about this principle. This idea that just because somebody commits a serious crime actually doesn't really mean that he or she is at high risk to engage in a similarly high, sort of high-risk crime or high-level crime. The crime itself is not always what is driving offending behavior. And not everybody poses that same level of risk. And so we have to be really critically, sort of focused, laser focused on this. And how do we know who's at high risk? Well, of course, we use actuarial and statistical measures of risk. The risk assessment tool that I'm sort of used to talking about is this women's risk need assessment that Aureen mentioned. It's one of the only validated risk needs assessment tools specifically designed from the ground up to work with women. And so in building that risk assessment tool, we went through a ton of statistical procedures to try to figure out which psychosocial needs are really most predictive of women's future offending behavior. We also know that actuarial measures are better than our general clinical judgment calls. I kind of like to think of this as this idea that, I have a lot of students in my class this semester, and certainly we're all on Zoom this semester. There's 50 students in my class, but if I were in a face-to-face class, as I'm thinking and pondering what it used to be like teaching in the classroom, there were always, of course, students sitting in the back of the room. And when I was first teaching, when I first started teaching, I used to think and assume that the students sitting in the back of the room were maybe not great students. Well, that's a false assumption, right? Just because somebody sits in the classroom, my clinical judgment was telling me that maybe they weren't going to be a good student. Just like our clinical judgment, when people come to us and sit in our offices as clients, we oftentimes get gut level feelings and judgment about maybe who might be successful on probation or supervision. And that's not always true, right? We actually know that clinical judgment is far less effective in using and assessing people's risk for recidivism compared to actuarial measures of risk. And so what do we really mean by risk for recidivism? And this is kind of an important point that I feel like sometimes gets a little lost in this idea of what we mean by risk. So risk really means the chance or the likelihood that someone, a client that we're working with, might engage in future antisocial or offending behavior. it doesn't actually mean and can't really predict really that well people's likelihood of engaging in dangerous behavior. It's not going to help us really predict the seriousness of the behavior. It's not necessarily going to help us understand future, like whether or not they're blameworthy in this crime. And perhaps most importantly for our discussion today, it also doesn't mean the same thing as risk for relapse or substance use relapse. Those are certainly related constructs or related ideas, but it doesn't actually mean quite the same thing. Risk for recidivism purely just means someone's probability or likelihood of engaging in future antisocial or offending behavior, subsequently after we complete an assessment. So what else makes interventions effective? Of course, this risk principle, as we continue to talk about it, of course, tells us who we should treat. And intensive supervision really should be reserved for high to medium risk for recidivism clients. And when people first hear that, they're a little bit, I don't know, sometimes they think that's a little counterintuitive. I know my students, when they're hearing this in my classroom for the first time, they sort of tell me, well, isn't it easier to work with the people who are low risk? Yeah, it's a lot easier actually to work with people who don't have a lot of what we call criminogenic or needs or risk factors, because they usually, have great attitudes about being on probation. They're fine with it. They know what they need to do. They have some additional protective factors. So they're oftentimes easier to work with, but as most of you probably know, we get the most bang for our buck, so to speak, in terms of changing offender behavior when we work with those people that we're actually really worried about. The people that we're worried about committing future crimes, and that's of course the high to medium risk folks. And most importantly, if we treat the low risk clients too intensively, we can actually make them worse. We can actually increase their recidivism and lower public safety. So this doesn't necessarily mean that low risk clients don't deserve and shouldn't get any treatment. It just simply means that we have to be careful about reserving the most intensive treatment for those who are medium to high risk. What else makes programming effective? The need principle, right? Or what to target in treatment. The science behind criminology and correctional treatment and rehabilitation tells us that there's some social and personality factors that are predictive of future antisocial behavior, and some things that are psychosocial needs that are not actually predictive. And so this idea that there are certain things that we really need to be focusing in on becomes really important. We'll talk a little bit more about what those are. Among those factors that are predictive, some are more or less predictive, right? Some are more important in terms of driving offending behavior. And then successfully treating those dynamic or the things that are really changeable and that we can work on in treatment and that are predictive, what we call criminogenic needs, is more likely to reduce an individual reoffending than if we're not working on those dynamic predictive needs. So in our world of correctional treatment, we talk oftentimes about the Big Four and the Central Eight. And I want to spend just a minute or two here. Most of you perhaps have seen these, but for those of you who haven't, these are the core criminogenic needs that we really have to be focusing on in treatment for the vast majority of offenders. I want you to take a look just for a moment and recognize that substance abuse, substance use is a criminogenic need. We know that people are more likely to engage in criminal behavior when they have addiction issues around substances. But it's not the number one need. It's not the top criminogenic need. It actually falls all the way down at number 8 because these are actually rank ordered in terms of their predictive ability, their statistical relationship with future antisocial behavior. And the first point, the first criminogenic need here too, criminal history, is not actually something we can really change, right? That's a static factor, that's somebody's history. But it is still important because people's past behavior is oftentimes predictive of their future behavior. And another important point that comes out of this idea of the central 8 needs is that people are high risk when they have a multitude of these problems, not just substance use and not just, antisocial friends, but when they start to tack on and have a lot of these needs, that's when we're going to see more and more people who are higher risk for recidivism, right? So many of these things oftentimes commingle and work together, which is why we oftentimes are hearing people say, we really, before we can even work on substance abuse, we have to start talking about people's antisocial attitudes, right? Before we can start talking about, some of the school and work problems and being able to hold down a job. Well, if people's attitudes about having a job are actually quite negative, right? Like, sometimes I hear people say, you guys are, a chump for working a 9 to 5. Are you kidding me? I can go stand on a corner and make X amount of money, selling my body or doing X, Y, and Z, right? Selling drugs. Those kinds of antisocial attitudes that we oftentimes, get used to hearing many offenders sort of bring to us are actually really important in a lot of these other criminogenic needs. So case plans are really going to help us focus on which needs need a priority in terms of intervention. Just an important point to make too, since we will be talking a little bit about women's risk needs assessments in these series, is that justice-involved women also have additional criminogenic needs that we don't typically see being measured on gender-neutral or male-based risk assessment tools. And so some of the science behind this work is also important to recognize. Symptoms of depression and anxiety, PTSD, can drive offending behavior among women. Many of you who work with women pretty closely understand the importance of unhealthy intimate relationships and how that's oftentimes also really facilitating co-offending with a partner or getting a lot of women in trouble. So these are also things that we might target in treatment. Of course, prior trauma we can't really do anything about, but we also understand there may be something going on with women in terms of prior or potentially current trauma that is facilitating dysfunctional coping mechanisms today. So those become important as well. So leading up again to a little bit more around this idea of case planning, I wanted to just sort of show you a couple photos here of Officer Andrew Skidmore from Portland, where I used to work in Portland, Oregon, and Aaron, he's working with Aaron here, right? Officer Andrew Skidmore is Aaron's parole agent, parole officer, and he's working with him to try to move him forward, right, in terms of his supervision. So not sure if you all can see this real well, but it says, asked how he can make friends who would be a better influence, Aaron responds, I don't know how to go about doing that. And for those of us who have been trained and really understand what this sort of sounds like in motivational interviewing, this is actually the beginning of what we call change talk. So Aaron doesn't quite know, right? Aaron has a substance abuse problem, but he also has an issue with hanging out with people who are not good for them, right? We see that a lot of times with people who have substance abuse. Who they hang out with and who they think are their friends really are their using friends. And so, right, if he doesn't really quite know how to have that, how to go about making better friends, I see this as 3 different ways that Officer Skidmore can kind of handle this in his office. Okay, so the first option is, Officer Skidmore might say, well, you know what? Yeah, it's really hard to make positive friends, and leave it at that, right? That's a missed opportunity to have a more in-depth conversation. Maybe the second thing Officer Skidmore might say is, you know what, you're right. It's really hard to make healthy, pro-social friends. It is really difficult. Let's talk about some of the steps that you might take in order, to try to find healthier friends, and then leave it at that. That's better, but it's still not quite concrete enough. It's still not quite creating what we are calling this case planning. We know that having antisocial friends is a risk factor, a high risk factor for a lot of folks. If we're not driving and targeting that change, if we're not helping in that effort to show Aaron what it's going to take to really map out driving that change for him and all of the steps, I mean, we have to think about, if you come back to yourself, right? How hard is it? I'm new to this community, Salt Lake City, right? I'm struggling to make new friends because, hello, we're in a pandemic, right? How easy is it? It's not easy. And so if I really want to do that, I know how to go about making some goals, making some strategies, taking some steps to be able to do that. I could start learning to play pickleball because I'm good at tennis, right? Okay, great. That's one option, right? I'm thinking of. But for those folks who are justice involved, they've got a whole host of things that they're dealing with. And for us too, I mean, it can feel really overwhelming as case managers or probation staff or service providers. So it helps us to start thinking about developing a case plan because it provides so many different things that maybe we hadn't even thought of before, including this idea of structure. So case plans, when we start to really literally write it down and map it out for folks, it helps them provide some structure. I don't think I need to go into super deep depth about why structure becomes really important for people who are justice involved and for us, because we have quite a few people, of course, on our caseloads. Documentation, it provides us with this document that we can go back to and discuss. So a case plan is a process that we go through with clients together in joint case planning, but it's also something that we write down. And I'll show you an example here shortly. It provides a clear set of expectations between what I'm going to do to help the client and also what the client is going to do to start to achieve his or her goals around one criminogenic need. We're only going to work on one or two at a time. And then provide some good efforts or good sort of ideas about decisions that need to be made. And like I said earlier, really provides us with a laser focus on what needs to be done. So to give you just sort of a brief example here, here's an example of generally what we use with the Women's Risk Need Assessment of what a case plan just looks like without it, of course, being completed. You see a date, the client's name, an ID number, the case manager's name or the facilitator or service provider's name. And then which criminogenic need are we going to start targeting first, right? The goal around that, barriers, strengths, tasks, and activities. In the next session, I'm planning on talking to you a little bit more in depth about what each one of these are, and we'll walk through this. But I thought it'd be a good idea for you all to see this just, on its face first, to be presented with it so you get kind of familiar with where we're going in the next two sessions. So generally speaking, right, the case plan should really be linked back, of course, to the assessment interview and to the assessment process. We need to be matching the case plan with the needs that people have. So for instance, if we're working with a client who doesn't have a lot of issues with unhealthy intimate relationships, that's not something we're going to target in case planning. Another example, right, around substance abuse. A lot of people who don't work in criminal justice or in, substance abuse, service providing, don't really understand that just because somebody commits a substance abuse offense or something that's related to drugs, it doesn't necessarily mean they have a substance abuse problem, right? So if they're selling drugs, they're selling methamphetamine, doesn't necessarily mean that they have a meth problem, right? That's going to come out in an assessment. If there isn't a problem, not really, we don't need any action around that. And then we want to individualize it for each person, of course, the client that we're working with, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel. As we get more and more skilled with doing case planning and understanding what that really looks like, we start to see many of the same things that are going to be available in terms of some of the tasks and activities that we'll work with our clients in creating and developing a case plan. The various steps that we'll get into talking a little bit more about in the next 2 sessions is this idea that we will start with risk factors, of course, from the actuarial assessment. We want to do this in conjunction, in partnership with the client. And when I train a lot of correctional staff, probation and parole agents, or correctional counselors around that, they initially are like, what? Like, shouldn't I just be telling the person what they should be doing? And I want to encourage you to think a little bit differently about that in terms of whenever you're trying to learn something new, right? We want to do it in conjunction with the people that we're working with. In this seminar, right? We only have 30 minutes for the lunch and learn. It would be my desire to get to know you, right? To get to know individual needs of the people that are in attendance today. And of course, I hope to do that during the Q&A when we get to it. But like, people learn better when you're developing a rapport with them, when you have that professional rapport and relationship, of course, with appropriate boundaries. We want people to take ownership in their change. And if you just tell me what to do as a client, I mean, I'll try to do it if I feel like I've got, good antisocial attitudes about it and if I'm motivated. But if I'm not motivated, I mean, that's not going to necessarily motivate you. I'll just say I'll do it and then come back to you next time and not really do it, right? So we have to really do it in conjunction with our clients. We'll develop a long-term goal, which can be quite lofty, can be things, like significantly reducing substance use might be a long-term goal. It may not even be abstinence yet. Developing the tasks, which are steps that the client will take toward that goal, and then identifying activities, which are the things that we're going to do. We also take some ownership in the case plan in helping drive that change. We're certainly not doing all the heavy lifting, the client is, but we have to guide and facilitate towards those steps. Identifying and prioritizing risk factors. I'm very well aware, of course, that there are certain practical considerations that we have to take into account, right? Program availability. There may not be enough bed space in a certain program that you may want to refer them to. Court-ordered or mandated treatment, right? Maybe they can't sort of decide what they're going to do because the court and the judge has decided for them what they have to do. But there's still some steps and some motivation that can happen in the case planning discussions, right? Again, as I mentioned earlier, we want to work on only 1 or 2 criminogenic needs or risk factors at a time. And then finally, I want to end it here. The benefits of joint case plan development. Again, I think it just becomes really important to do this in conjunction with the client. It increases efficiency of time, helps them understand the expectations that are to come. And you'll see on the case plan too, we actually have 2 people sign it. You're going to sign it as the facilitator and the service provider of the facilitator of change, and then the client is actually going to sign it. It sort of seals the deal in terms of owning case planning. So I wondered if we just might end there for a moment and see what's come up in the Q&A. We've only got a few more minutes left. See if we've got questions. So Debbie's asking, the focus of treatment should be on medium-high offenders and not low-risk offenders. Did she mention if the client has intensive needs, do we focus treatment with them as well, or do we not see the results? So it depends, Debbie, on whether or not those are criminogenic needs, right? So if they're things that we know are predictive of people's future antisocial behavior, then those are things that we definitely want to be targeting in case planning. And, like I said sort of earlier, people come to us with a whole host of things. We have to decide with the client what he or she is prepared to work on first. I've worked with a lot of folks before in the past with substance abuse. And when I do a lot of coaching with probation and parole agents around being more gender responsive with female offenders, this is true for men too. Some people are not ready to work on their substance abuse right away. I'm just not ready to do it. And they're ready to do some other things, but we have to build their self-efficacy, their confidence, and their ability to achieve some other forms of change before we can even tackle substance abuse. Hope that sort of answers your question. If they have intensive needs and they're criminogenic needs, yes, we definitely focus treatment on them. Absolutely. So there is this sometimes a difficulty in understanding the difference between risk and need. They are related, and I want to make sure that you feel like I'm clearing that up for you. If not, please let me know. Okay. I see Q&A. I think that's all we've got for Q&A. Maureen, is there anything in the chat I need to be aware of?
Sorry, I don't know. Sounding like someone in the asked you had access to PowerPoint.
Oh, I'd be happy to share the PowerPoint. Yeah, if I'm assuming we have the email addresses of the participants, so I'd be happy to share that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, for some reason I can't access the chat. So I can see the Q&A, but I can't see the chat features. Unless if there's no more questions, I'm surprised. I'm surprised you guys don't have more questions for me.
Perhaps think of something.
Yeah. Well, at least, yeah, tell me what risk assessments you guys are using. What I mean, I don't know if you can unmute you. Actually, I don't know if you can chime in at this point. But yeah, I'm used to hearing feedback from folks. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, now I can actually see. I see the LSCMI. Yes, of course, the LSCMI is a great validated risk assessment tool. So Rob, you probably do understand this idea of case planning for treatment need if you've been through the LSCMI training. I also just maybe want to reiterate the point too that, you know, it's really, yeah, really a common occurrence. It's the hardest thing for agencies and for staff to pick up, this case planning piece, as Maureen mentioned at the beginning session. It's one of the hardest things to really grasp. And so I get that it's difficult. So I think we're right at 12:30. Ori, do you want to close us out?
Emily?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, it's Kristen.
Yeah.
Did you see Angie's question about gender and criminogenic needs?
I did not see it. Can you repeat it for me if you see it, Christian?
Yes. Regarding identifying additional needs for women, issues criminogenic on current research, or are they considered or are they being studied if they are criminal?
I see. Yeah, it was in the answered column, so I'm now seeing it now. Wonderful. So thank you, Angie. So yeah, are those listed as criminogenic? They are actually criminogenic needs. So there's quite a bit of science behind gender responsive risk assessment, which really is driven by this women's risk need assessment that I helped co-create many years ago. Be happy to discuss with you individually or sort of talk a little bit more about that in the next session. This idea that actually gender needs to be at the forefront of all of risk, need, and responsivity. Gender, in my view, and in my research has shown, is no longer just a specific responsivity issue. It needs to be, because risk means something different for women. Women have additional criminogenic needs. Even when you look at some of the gender neutral criminogenic needs that are the same across gender, like substance abuse, we know that the science of substance use with women also looks a little bit different in how they begin their addiction and oftentimes end their addiction. It looks really different across gender. So not just a responsivity issue for criminogenic needs that I've listed. Yeah.
We hope you were able to take something useful or insightful from it and maybe apply it into your daily life. We know these sessions are short, so if you have any questions or comments or are in need of further information about additional technical assistance after the closure of this meeting, please reach out to us via email at UCJC at utah.edu. Our next session on case planning is next week, the 17th of September, and Emily will build on what was discussed today. And the final session will be the 24th of September. Okay, have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Bye.